You've got your show recorded, you've spent hours putting the finishing touches on it, and it's time to sit back and enjoy the fame, fortune, and critical acclaim that your podcast deserves. But wait, you've forgotten the sexiest part: metadata and SEO. Don't hit stop because this stuff is important, and we're going to try to have some fun with it. Hey, I'm John Lagomarsino, and this is I Should Start a Podcast, a show from Anchor about the ins and outs of podcasting. Today, we're talking about packaging your show to give it the best chance for success. We'll be talking about things you can do to position your podcast as a whole, but also to make sure that each of your episodes is poised to do well. But before we do any of that, let me drive something home. The best thing that you can do to make sure your podcast performs well with your audience is to make it good. Podcasting is still an area where quality really is rewarded, and making your podcast the best that it can be is probably the number one way to make sure that people hear it. But of course, there are some things that you can do to make it more likely that people will find your podcast in the first place. So let's start with a big one: your show art. This is often the first impression anyone will have of your show, so it sort of has to accomplish a lot. Your art can communicate the feel of your show and the attitude behind it. It can be eye-catching and impressive, and it can steer people toward your show. So the details. Your show art should be a square image, usually 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. In most cases, you'll want to include the title of your show, large and legible. That's because most of the time the art will be displayed in podcast apps at small sizes. Don't go overboard with detailed imagery and icons all over the place for the same reason. Some of the best show art is simple and impactful. The art for this show is really simple. It's just the name of the show in large type with a small tagline and what the show is. It's hard to overstate how important your art is. It's very often your audience's first impression of your show and the visual identity that they'll associate with it. So make it creative and bold and all about who you are. And on that note, I want to share an unused portion of my interview from last week with Katie Lee and Dominic Kramer, the hosts of The Europeans. Their podcast art basically breaks all of the rules. It's essentially just a crude cutout of French President Emmanuel Macron's head floating in the middle of a radial rainbow pattern with absolutely no text or context anywhere to be found. What's the story behind your art?
Yeah, that was never meant to be a permanent thing. That's my very basic Photoshop skills coming into action there. For us, like we didn't want to do something boring like here's the European flag because it's just a little bit too obvious. So we were like looking around, I guess, at well-known figures in Europe, and Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron are probably like the best two most recognizable faces for people generally in Europe right now. The one from our Twitter logo is a picture of Emmanuel Macron shouting. It's from a video that went viral during his election campaign where he was just absolutely screaming his head off. It's really funny. And somebody did a death metal remix of it. Vive la République! Vive la France! So we took a screen grab from that, put it on a rainbow, mostly because it looks like a Doge, you know, the meme with the dog.
I just love that it basically breaks every rule that I've ever been told about how to do art, but it totally works.
That's the best review Katie's ever had for any of her Photoshop work.
We don't know the rules. I mean, no one told us the rules. We've never had to make art for a podcast before, so we literally I did it myself using GIMP, which is like the free version of Photoshop, and that was the very best I could do. It gets many compliments and some not so complimentary comments. Certainly at the beginning, there were some people saying, this is very disrespectful artwork. But at the end of the day, our audience is quite young. They don't take themselves too seriously. And we're not trying to ridicule Macron in any way. It's just a funny picture.
Now, in good conscience, I can't recommend that you follow their lead and put no branding on your art. But Katie and Dominic stumbled onto a strange idea that mostly worked for them, and their colorful art certainly stands out. I don't know what my point here is really, except to say that rules have exceptions and you should follow your gut. Again, make good, honest stuff and the rest will fall into place. Okay, who's ready for some metadata? Great! Seriously, metadata, all of the text and the data around your show and episodes, is really, really important. It's how search engines catalog your show, it's how podcast platforms surface it, and it's how listeners see the show in their favorite podcast app. So while it might not be the sexiest topic, we're going to dive into some best practices. We'll start with your podcast's title. It should be the name of your show, obviously. Now, avoid the temptation to type it in all caps or to add unpronounceable punctuation and emojis. And keep it reasonably short. Podcast apps and search results will truncate your podcast title if it gets too long. Then there's your podcast description. It should be a quick explanation of what your podcast is, accessible to someone who's never heard of it. Don't waste space by putting the name of your podcast in the show description. It's already there in the title. Instead, get to the point. Use this space to explain what question your show answers, or what the hook of your show is, or what a listener can expect from each episode. And don't tell us that your show is a podcast. We know. That's your show itself. But it's also important to take care of each episode's metadata too. So let's start with episode titles. In most cases, your episode titles should be short and enticing. It's all right to give an episode a title that creates some curiosity. When your episode loads in a listener's podcast app, the title could be what gets them to hit play. Try to avoid putting episode numbers directly in your episode titles, especially if your show is distributed on Apple Podcasts. There are special season and episode number fields that you can fill out instead, and the podcast app will take care of displaying the numbering and ordering your episodes correctly. On Anchor, you can edit those numbers in the Advanced tab of the Episode Editor. It's a great idea to include season and episode numbers for every episode you publish. And while you're in there, notice that there are some special labels for episode, trailer, and bonus types of content. Use those tools to identify the type of episode that you're publishing. For example, if you added a little bit of bonus content between episodes, mark it as bonus, and it'll show up in some podcast apps labeled as a bonus episode. Your episode description can be used in various ways. But it's a good idea to start that description with a short summary of what's going on in the episode. Again, you can make this enticing to create a quote-unquote curiosity gap that can nudge your listener to hit play. But try to give some context and a reason to listen. And if you're thinking about search engine optimization, keep in mind that your episode description can help with that. A lot of podcasters also use the episode description area to include show notes, so things like relevant links, credits, or an outline of the show's contents. That's a good use of the space. Listeners who want to know more about what's going on in your show or the things you're talking about can look to the show notes for that information. Overall, try to put yourself in the mindset of someone who's looking for your podcast or is already subscribed. Try to identify the information you'd need to be convinced to listen to your show. That's what all of this metadata and packaging is really about. Creating a clear bundle of information for your audience and your potential audience so that your show makes the most sense in their lives. And I should also mention that having pristine packaging and metadata can only help get your show featured around the web and in podcast apps. And that's great. It means more people can find and fall in love with your work. And that's a win-win. Thanks for listening. I Should Start a Podcast is a production of Anchor, the easiest way to make a podcast. You can sign up and start creating at anchor.fm. If you like this show, remember that you can hear it here on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, or any app you use to listen to podcasts. If you want to get in touch, you can leave me a voice message. Some of you had some comments from the last episode, so let's hear them.
Love, love, love the information. I think this is great, and I'm looking forward to much more that you put out there. Check it out if you got a chance. Raw Relationships. We chat about all things relationships, keeping them real and wonderful.
This is awesome what you guys are doing there at Anchor. Keep it up. People need it. People demand it, and you guys are delivering.
I would love to hear whatever questions you have so I can plan future episodes. Just download the Anchor mobile app, search for I Should Start a Podcast, and tap the message button. Thanks to Katie Lee and Dominic Kramer. You can find their podcast, The Europeans, on Anchor or wherever you listen to podcasts. They're on Twitter @EuropeansPod. My colleague Brendan Bigley, as usual, produced all the music in this episode. You can find links to all of his stuff in the show description. Thanks so much for listening. I'm John Lagomarsino, and I'll be back next week with another episode of I Should Start a Podcast. Talk to you then.